Marcus is 47 years old, and it's a Tuesday morning in February. He's looking at his phone calendar, specifically at the blank Sunday slot stretching out for the next 4 months. No game, no pre-game show, no post-game breakdown. For the first time in 22 years, his Sundays belong to nobody. He told a forum he felt like he'd lost a limb. Most men would call that laziness or maybe a midlife thing. But what Marcus was actually feeling has a name in psychology: identity withdrawal. And almost no man who goes through it has that name ready when it hits. Here's the pattern worth paying attention to. Men who quit sports and don't understand the psychology spend months feeling like they gave something up. Men who understand it realize they didn't lose anything. They got something back. The void Marcus felt on those empty Sundays wasn't the problem. It was the upgrade. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why. We're going to walk through 5 psychological anchors that explain what sports obsession actually does to the male brain. And then 3 concrete replacements that redirect that energy towards something you actually built. Section 1. The vicarious achievement trap. Start with what Marcus's Sunday looked like at its peak. His team wins, and he walks into Monday with his chest out, confident, sharp. He carries himself differently at work. His team loses, and Sunday night is ruined. Monday morning is gray, and by Tuesday, he's still replaying fourth-quarter decisions made by a coaching staff in a city he doesn't live in, about players he's never met, in a game he had 0 influence over. Same neurological signature as real achievement, real failure. His brain couldn't tell the difference. This is what Branscombe and Wan identified back in 1992. When self-esteem becomes contingent on team outcomes, the brain processes wins and losses the way it processes personal success and personal rejection. The emotional response isn't irrational. It's the brain doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's just aimed at the wrong target. Psychologists call the 2 mechanisms burgeoning and corfing, basking in reflected glory and cutting off reflected failure. When your team wins, you lean in. We won. Our defense was incredible. When they lose, you pull back. They blew it. The coaching is a disaster. Your brain is constantly borrowing and returning identity based on outcomes you didn't produce. And it does this so smoothly, so automatically, that most men never notice it's happening. The deeper problem isn't the emotional swings. It's what the borrowed pride replaces. Your brain runs on a feedback loop. You do something hard, you get a result, you feel competent, you push further. That loop is what builds a real sense of self over time. But when the brain gets a competence signal from reflected glory, from a touchdown you didn't run, from a championship you didn't win, it satisfies the same hunger without requiring any of the work. So the drive to go earn your own result gets quieter. Not gone, just quieter. Marcus didn't notice this for 22 years because the signal kept coming. Every season, fresh stakes, fresh outcomes, fresh emotional payoff. His brain's achievement loop was running. It just wasn't running on anything he'd built. William James identified the mechanism in 1890. The deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. The sports industry didn't invent that drive. They industrialized it. They figured out that if they could make a man feel appreciated by proxy, through team identity, they could satisfy his need for significance without ever meeting it. The craving gets fed, but the person never grows. That's the trap. One man on a forum put it clearly. He wrote, "The week after our playoff loss, I was useless at work. Couldn't focus, genuinely irritable, snapped at my wife. I caught myself and thought, what is wrong with me? A game I didn't play." That's not a character flaw. That's an externalized locus of control operating at full volume, and most men don't recognize it until they're already in it. Now, the vicarious achievement trap is only half the picture, because once the brain gets hooked on borrowed identity, it doesn't stop at pride. It goes all the way to belonging. And that's where the substitution gets harder to see and harder to leave. Section 2. Tribal Identity Substitution. Here's something most men won't admit out loud. The game itself was never really the point. The point was the room full of people who cared about the same thing you did. Marcus's social calendar for 22 years was built around game days: Sunday at Dave's place, Thursday night at the bar, playoff watch parties that felt like the closest thing to a real community he had as an adult. The friendships were genuine, the laughter was real, the text threads were alive. But pull the game out of the center of it, and almost none of those connections had a second layer underneath. This is the tribal identity substitution. Sports fandom doesn't just borrow your sense of achievement, it borrows your sense of belonging. And belonging is the deeper need. Psychologists Horton and Wohl wrote about this as far back as 1956. Their parasocial relationship framework described how the brain treats consistent, emotionally engaging media figures as if they were real social bonds. The loyalty you feel toward a team, the personal investment in a player's career, the grief when a franchise moves cities. Your brain is processing all of that as genuine relational experience. Not because you're confused, but because the neurological pathways for real bonds and parasocial bonds overlap significantly. The brain doesn't automatically distinguish between a friend who shows up for you and a quarterback you've watched for a decade. Both activate the same belonging circuitry. So the fandom fills a real need. That's why it works. That's also why leaving it feels like abandonment. What makes this harder is the genetic layer. Research on the DRD47 repeat allele, a dopamine receptor gene variant, suggests some men are neurologically wired for higher engagement in spectator contexts, higher novelty-seeking, stronger emotional response to group dynamics, more intense reward from shared experiences. If you've always been the guy who felt the game more than others in the room, this might be part of why. It's not a weakness, it's wiring. But wiring isn't destiny. It's a starting point, and it can be redirected toward contexts that actually build something. The real cost of tribal identity substitution shows up when the game goes away and the friendships have to stand on their own. One man described it this way in a forum post after he stopped watching during his second year of a serious health scare. He wrote, "I thought these were my best friends, and then I realized we literally had nothing to talk about. Every conversation looped back to the team, the season, the draft. Without that, we just kind of sat there. I felt like I'd been in a relationship for years and just found out we had nothing in common. That's not a failure of friendship. That's what happens when the connective tissue is passive observation rather than shared construction. The relationship was real. The foundation wasn't. Tribal belonging feels identical, whether it's earned or borrowed, right up until the moment you need it to hold weight. A shared history of watching games together is real history. But it doesn't translate into the kind of bond where someone shows up when your life gets hard, or builds something alongside you, or knows who you actually are when the jersey's off. The identity substitution explains why men stay long past the point it makes sense. But there's a second mechanism keeping them locked in, and it runs even deeper. It's written into the chemistry of how the brain chases reward. Section 3. Dopamine/time. Sync asymmetry and learned helplessness. Let's talk about the math, because the math is where most men finally feel it in their chest. The average man watching NFL football during the season puts in about 6.3 hours a week. That's not counting the pre-game coverage, the post-game breakdown, the fantasy league management, the highlight reels on Tuesday, the injury reports on Wednesday, the draft analysis in the off-season. Just the games, 6.3 hours a week. Run that out over 20 years and you're sitting at more than 6,500 hours. That's roughly the same time it takes to reach professional level fluency in a foreign language, to build a small business from zero to revenue, to go from no fitness background to competitive athlete. That's not a judgment. That's just the number. And the number belongs to someone else's story. Now, here's why the brain doesn't register any of this as a problem while it's happening. Sports consumption runs on a variable reward schedule. You don't know when the big play is coming. You don't know if your team pulls it out in the final 2 minutes or collapses. That unpredictability is the engine. The brain's dopamine system doesn't fire hardest at the reward. It fires hardest at the anticipation of a possible reward. This is the same mechanism behind slot machines. Same architecture, different packaging. The variability keeps the brain locked in a state of low-effort, high-stimulation alertness. It feels like engagement. It registers like stakes. But your prefrontal cortex isn't solving anything. Your body is running the stress response of real competition without any of the growth that real competition produces. Desch and Ryan's self-determination theory, developed through decades of motivation research, identifies 3 things the brain actually needs to build lasting internal drive. Autonomy, the sense that your choices are your own. Competence, the sense that your skills are growing. And relatedness, the sense that your connections are real. Passive consumption scores near 0 on all 3. You didn't choose the outcome. You didn't develop a skill. And as we saw in the last section, the belonging it provides sits on a shallow foundation. Your nervous system gets stimulated. Your life doesn't move. That's the asymmetry. The feeling of stakes without the growth that comes from real stakes. One man on a forum described the exact moment this hit him. He wrote, "I was watching a fourth-quarter comeback, out of my seat, heart pounding, hands shaking, and mid-celebration. I looked around my living room. Empty takeout containers, same couch, same spot I'd been in for 6 hours. My team just pulled off a miracle, and my life was exactly the same as it was before kickoff." That's not cynicism. That's the asymmetry landing. But Seligman's research from 1975 points to something even more corrosive than lost time. His learned helplessness work showed that when a brain is repeatedly exposed to outcomes it cannot influence, it stops trying to influence outcomes at all. The original studies were with animals in inescapable stress situations, but the pattern maps cleanly onto human behavior. Repeated exposure to high-stakes situations where your input means nothing trains the neural pathways for agency to go quiet. You start to passively accept results rather than push toward them. And here's the part that matters. The conditioning doesn't stay contained to the couch. It bleeds. Men who spend years emotionally invested in outcomes they can't affect don't just become passive sports fans. They become more passive, full stop. Not dramatically, not in ways that are easy to trace. But the posture of watching and waiting, of hoping the right result happens, starts to feel more natural than the posture of acting and building. The learned helplessness isn't about football. It just lives there first. A man who'd been a season ticket holder for 11 years wrote this after his second year away. "I didn't realize how much of my life I was treating like a fan, waiting to see how things turned out, hoping the right people made the right moves. Even at work, I kept waiting for the right boss, the right project, the right break. I never thought of myself as passive, but I was. I was a spectator in my own career." That's learned helplessness after it's migrated. It doesn't announce itself. It just shifts the posture from building to watching. Marcus noticed this at month 2 of quitting. He wasn't suddenly more productive. He wasn't crushing goals or waking up at 5 in the morning. What he noticed was subtler and, honestly, more unsettling. He noticed how much mental and emotional bandwidth he'd been running on other people's decisions, how many hours of any given week he'd spent processing outcomes he never had any hand in. The void wasn't empty. It was loud with the absence of noise he'd mistaken for meaning. That awareness was uncomfortable. It didn't feel like progress. It felt like the floor had shifted. And that discomfort, that specific low-grade dread of a calendar without built-in stakes, is exactly where most men quit on quitting. Because what comes next isn't freedom. It's a crisis. And understanding that crisis is the difference between men who make the shift and men who just go find another team. Section 4. Withdrawal Identity Crisis. Here's what nobody tells you about quitting something that's been part of your identity for 2 decades. The hardest part isn't the first Sunday, it's the 3rd month. Research on heavy sports fans, defined as those for whom fandom is a primary identity anchor, finds that around 67% report a significant identity void when they reduce or eliminate consumption in their 40s. Not mild restlessness, a genuine gap in the sense of self. And because most men don't have a psychological framework for what's happening, they diagnose it wrong. They call it boredom. They call it a phase. Some go back. And the ones who go back almost never understand why. The void moves through stages, and knowing the stages is the only thing that makes them survivable. First comes numbness. The absence of the ritual feels neutral, almost fine. You fill the slot with something else, a project, a long drive, extra hours at work. You think you've handled it cleanly. You haven't. The numbness is just the delay before the nervous system figures out the signal's gone. Then comes restlessness, a low-frequency agitation that doesn't attach to anything specific. You're not sad, you're not angry, you're just unmoored. The week has no obvious anchor point anymore. Sunday used to organize the emotional calendar, the build-up, the release, the post-game processing. Without it, the days blur in a way that feels strangely juvenile, like you've lost a structure you didn't know you needed. Then comes the social anxiety most men won't name out loud. What do I talk about now? This one is quieter than the others, but it cuts deeper, because it reveals something. If the game was your primary conversational currency for years, its absence exposes a gap in your social identity you weren't aware of carrying. Marcus at month 3 described the Sunday slot as feeling like an open wound. Not dramatic pain, more like the persistent awareness of something missing, the way your tongue finds a gap where a tooth used to be. Free time sounds like a gift until you realize free time requires a self to fill it with, and he'd been renting someone else's. That's the sharpest insight inside the withdrawal crisis. Free time without identity is just exposure. It shows you what's there when the borrowed scaffolding comes down. For some men, that's terrifying. For the men who stay in it, it turns out to be the most useful information they've ever had about themselves. One man wrote about his first 3 months post-sports this way. I kept expecting to feel free. Instead, I felt weirdly grief-like, almost embarrassed by how much I missed it, like I was mourning something I wasn't supposed to care about that much. That grief is real. It's not weakness, and it's not regression. It's a legitimate psychological loss response to the removal of a consistent identity anchor. The brain doesn't sort its attachment bonds by whether they're rational. It just registers the loss. Dacian Ryan's framework helps explain the disorientation. Autonomy, the first driver of intrinsic motivation, doesn't feel good in the early stages of reclamation. It feels destabilizing. Because autonomy means your sense of self now depends entirely on what you choose to do with it, and the brain hasn't built that reward architecture yet. It's been outsourcing the job for years. Rebuilding it from scratch feels less like freedom and more like starting over in a language you barely speak. But here's the reframe that changes everything. The withdrawal isn't the malfunction, it's the process. The void is the system running an uninstall on borrowed identity to clear space for something you actually authored. The discomfort isn't a sign you made the wrong call, it's the sign the recalibration is working. Once you understand what the void actually is, you can use it. Here's exactly how Marcus did. Section 5. The 3 replacements. So what do you actually do with the void once you understand it? Not hobbies. That framing is too small, and it misses the point. What you're looking for are identity reconstruction tools, activities that satisfy autonomy, competence, and relatedness in ways passive consumption structurally cannot. The Sunday slot doesn't need to be filled, it needs to be redirected toward something with your name on the outcome. The first is skill stacking. Pick one high feedback skill with a visible progress line. Coding output, language fluency, business revenue, lift numbers, anything where the scoreboard updates based on what you put in. Then, steal the Sunday slot directly. Same time, same ritual energy, same sense of occasion. What changes is the input. And instead of tracking someone else's stat line, you build your own. You track your numbers the way you tracked scores, but these numbers belong to your story. The brain's competence loop doesn't care whether it's measuring a quarterback rating or your monthly revenue. It responds to progress. Give it progress you produced. The second is strength training, 3 times a week minimum. The schedule is the point, not the motivation, not the mood, not whether you feel like it on a given Thursday. The consistency of showing up is what builds the identity anchor, because identity follows behavior, not intention. Train in a community setting when you can. The gym floor replicates the tribal energy of game day, but ties it to shared effort rather than shared observation. And track your lifts like scores. Progressive overload is a scoreboard you control completely. Your nervous system responds to it with the same reward signal it used to route toward a fourth quarter comeback, except this time, you were the one in the fourth quarter. The third is a male friendship pod, and the size matters. 2 or 3 men, not 10. Real tribal bonds don't scale the way social media logic suggests they do. Depth requires proximity, consistency, and mutual stake in each other's outcomes. Build a weekly anchor event that isn't passive, a shared training session, a project you're both building, a skill one of you teaches the other, and shift the conversational currency. Move from, "Did you see the game?" to "What are you building?" That one question does more to separate borrowed identity from constructed identity than any framework I can give you. Marcus at month 4 wasn't a different person. He was just more present in his own life. His personal stat line was growing. The Sunday slot had a different kind of weight to it, heavier in some ways, quieter in others, but unmistakably his. The counterintuitive payoff. Quitting didn't make him more disciplined. It made him more aware of where his sense of self had been living. That awareness was the real upgrade. Conclusion. The void isn't emptiness. It's the clearing where a self-authored identity gets built. Take the Sunday slot this week. Don't replace it with another screen. Sit in it long enough to feel what Marcus felt, because that discomfort is data. It's telling you exactly where the work is. The men who make this shift don't quit sports because sports are bad. They quit because they finally want to know what they're capable of when the scoreboard belongs to them. Men. What's the one thing you've been watching someone else do that you know you should be building yourself? Women. What does the man you respect actually spend his time on, watching or constructing? Let's talk about it. If this landed for you, subscribe. This is exactly what Psych Blueprint is built for.